Okay, welcome again to microeconomics. Um, Today we're going to have our first online lecture and we're going to cover some review material on demand and supply. So most of the material is going to be things that you've seen in Intro to Economics. Before going through the lesson, I want to give you some basic instructions. Um, Basically, these videos that you watch, you're going to watch one video every week, and these videos are really the same as the lecture material. So it's the same as being in a class and getting the content. It's part of your learning process, and you should treat it just as you treat a regular lecture. The advantage of doing the videos is that you can watch them in your own time. You can watch them over the weekend, and you can rewatch them. So if any part of it is not clear, you can go back to it. It's always available to you. So sometimes you might want to pause and rewatch certain parts that may not be clear. And they are more interactive. There are questions throughout the videos just to make sure that you're following, just to give you some feedback right away, whether you got the material or you missed something. All right. So as you watch these videos, you must take notes on them, just as you would take notes on a regular lecture. And you have to show me your notes at the end of the course, just to impress me. Yeah. So all of the good notes that you take, you have to show it to me. Now, the way you take notes is really up to you. Okay. This is really for yourself. Okay. So be resourceful, be mature, do your own notes. If you want to summarize, go ahead. That's fine. My idea is that if I write something on the slides, I think it's worth writing it down. Um, you can use your own words. You can summarize it if you want. But usually I put a condensed version of my own notes. I give you complete stuff on this slide. So if something is written on this slide, you want to take notes on that. If you see I emphasize something or I repeat something, you want to write that down also. Usually I emphasize common student mistakes. Okay, so you have to be a little bit alert with the audio also as you go through. Um, Equations and graphs, do a neat job of them because they're useful when you do problems. Whenever you watch a video, at the end of it, there are a set of questions and practices, and you bring them to the next class. So we mark together in the class, and in the following class you get some practice material. So you get questions. A lot of times you do the questions in teams or pairs, and sometimes you do them alone. All of this is meant to make sure that you're not falling behind. So whenever and the way you can prepare for the class material and the activities is to follow these online lectures. Okay, as you watch each video, it's a good idea to record this slide number on the top left corner for future reference. It's going to help you. All right, so let's begin. We're going to have a review of demand and supply, which you've seen before. When we talk about demand, we are talking about buyers or consumers. You can use these terms interchangeably. They're the same. That's one side of the market. That's one side of the economy. The other side is the supply, which is the same as sellers or producers. Again, if you don't like any of those terms, you can use, the other two. Okay, they're the same. So when we put together demand and supply, we get market. So you're gonna hear this word market a lot. Whenever we talk about market, it simply means the interaction of buyers and sellers. It means demand and supply put together. All right, so that's the idea of a market. So what is demand? It's how much ice cream or any other good or service consumers are willing and able to purchase at any given price, holding other factors constant. What is that? That there is a Latin term for it? That assumption that other things being constant? Yeah, ceteris paribus. So assuming that nothing else changes, we only focus on the relationship between price and quantity. Okay, so we have a curve called the demand curve. Sometimes it's a linear line, it's a straight line. Sometimes it's curvy. It doesn't make a difference. The important thing is what it shows. It shows the relationship between price and quantity demanded. This thing, by the way, is between. If you don't know what it is, you might want to write it down. It's between. The law of demand is a very intuitive thing. It says when the price of a product falls, its quantity demanded increases, all other things being equal. So that's again is the ceteris paribus assumption. So let's say if the price of ice cream is, I don't know, $5 a cone, People buy a certain amount. If the price falls, then people buy more. Okay, so that's kind of obvious. You can also use shorthand notation, just say when price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. So it goes both ways. If the price is higher, quantity demanded is lower. If price is lower, quantity demanded is higher. And if you graph that, you're going to get a negative slope. The line is going to slope downward. It's going to be downhill. It's an inverse relationship or a negative correlation. So we have two important things here, willing and able. When we say willing, we're talking about the person's preference, what they like. When we talk about able, we're talking about the person's budget. All right, so you might want to pause here and take some notes, and you might want to record the slide number for your future reference. Central assumption in economics is that ceteris paribus assumption that other things are equal. Now the question is, what if other things are not equal? What's going to happen? So that's where you get a shifter. If you remember, sometimes the demand curve or the supply curve shifts to the right or the left. So we have to be able to analyze when it shifts and why or how it shifts. So let's look at some of these interesting events. Basically, demand shifters are external events, exogenous variables. So things that happen elsewhere and that affect the market that we're talking about. These are factors other than the current price of the same product. Okay, so that's going to look a good way of summarizing what demand shifters are, anything other than the current price. So the first thing is the consumer's income, which is what you earn on a regular basis. So that's your paycheck. Okay. And here we have to talk about two kinds of goods. There are normal goods, which are things that you consume because you like it. Okay, because these are desirable things. So this again is because. If you don't know what it is, write it down. Most goods are normal. Most goods are things that we like, and if our income goes up, then the demand for normal goods would go up because we can afford more of them. So this is going to include almost all goods and services. The other type is going to look at an exception. So that's inferior good, and that's something that you consume because of budget constraint. You have no other choice. So if your income goes up, then your demand for inferior goods is going to drop because you can afford better alternatives. All right. So my example of that would be BlackBerry cell phones. Yeah. I mean, who would buy BlackBerry anyway? If you have more income, you're going to switch to some real phone. Yeah. So that's the idea of inferior goods. You can think of anything that, anything that people buy because of their low income, not because they like it, but because they don't have any other choice. Now that's about income. The same, you can say the same thing about wealth. And wealth is what you have accumulated, the value of your possessions. Okay, so that's a form of a stock as opposed to income, which is a form of flow. So sometimes they use interchangeably, but they're a little bit different. So income is a flow, wealth is a stock. Okay, again, you might want to pause here, record the slide number, and take down some notes. Second demand shifter is the price of a related product. And again, we're going to have two types of these. One of them is called substitutes in consumption. These are two products that can be consumed instead of one another. They can serve the same purpose. Okay, so the classical example of that is Coke versus Pepsi. Those are similar items. They do the same thing, right? They're comparable. You can think of movie tickets versus Netflix. And you can think of other things. So here, I'm giving you some blanks. You have to fill in your own blanks. Make sure your notes are complete. You're responsible for these. So what's a substitute for hamburgers? What's a substitute for STM tickets or pass? What's the substitute for tea? A substitute for skis, and a substitute for butter. Yeah. So think of similar items that serve the same purpose. Now think of this. What happens if the price of Coke goes up? What happens to the demand for Pepsi? So if the price of one substitute goes up, the demand for the other substitute is going to go up because people will switch away from the more expensive alternative to the cheaper one. So if Coke becomes more expensive, people switch to Pepsi. The other type of related product is a complement, and complements are two products that are consumed together as a package. So think of PC and software. You need software to run your PC. Okay. Think of car and gas. Yeah. What's a complement for Netflix? What's the complement for hamburgers? What's the complement for coffee? And what's the complement for skis? Again, write down these things for yourself. Write at least one example for each. You can come up with more. Now, think of this. What happens to the demand? Let's say PC and software. If the price of computers goes up, what's going to happen to the demand for software? If one of them goes up, then the demand for the other one goes down because the overall cost of the bundle is now higher. It costs more to consume the whole thing. Okay, so pause here and write down your notes. A good way of summarizing substitutes and complements. If A and B are substitutes, remember the example, the classical example is Coke and Pepsi. If they're substitutes, what it means is that you consume either A or B. If they're complements, if they're things that you consume together, then you have A and B. So that's kind of like a logical operator that's used sometimes. It helps to remember. So this or and is a good way of capturing substitutes and complements. So you can take a break here as you watch this funny clip about complements and substitutes.
I wonder which is the cereal for me. Oh, excuse me, could you tell me where I might find the Burns ooze?
Sorry, Pops. They don't put nobodies on cereal boxes.
Yeah. I suppose this one looks a bit like me. Oh, thank you, Chappie. I ventured in to search for milk when the door snapped shut behind me.
Yeah, those dairy cases are death traps.
Ketchup? 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 Huh. I'm in way over my head.
He's talking to the ketchup now. Burns is sure acting nutty.
Maybe going broke and losing his plants destroyed his brain. Could you come along with us, sir?
Are you here to solve my ketchup problem?
Yes, that's right.
All right, what a mess. So the different types of cereal are substitutes. Ketchup and catsup are also substitutes. Cereal and milk would be complements. Our next demand shifter is taste and preferences, which include events that affect the popularity or attractiveness of a product. This is a fairly wide category which includes a lot of things. Basically, it has to do with people's inclination. So think of the weather for ice cream. If it's too hot, it's going to increase people's taste for ice cream, right? So that's how we classify weather. Other examples are advertisement, medical reports, fashion, and weather. So for instance, medical report, think of this. If it's announced that ice cream could cause heart attack, then the demand for ice cream is going to drop. If it's found out that no, actually ice cream is going to reduce the chance of getting cancer, then the demand for ice cream is going to increase. Yeah. Or fashion, if a celebrity like Beyonce wears a type of hat, then everybody would want to buy that stupid kind of hat. Yeah. And by the way, she does wear different types of hats once in a while. Another shifter is future expectations, and we have two types here. One is expecting higher future income. If people expect a promotion, a raise in the future, they're gonna buy today. Okay. Now you might be like, hang on, if you don't have the money, how are you gonna buy more today? And the answer is you can buy on credit. Okay. Buying on credit means you borrow. You take a loan, which means you create debt. Now you might be like, oh no, I'm not gonna do that. If I don't have the money, I'm not gonna buy. Well, think of this. Think of an extreme example. Let's say you just found out that you won the lottery in your dreams, but let's say you did, but you're not given the money right now. You're gonna be given the money later. What are you gonna do? Are you gonna just stay and like before without doing anything until you get the actual money, or if you know the money is coming, you're gonna start buying more? Yeah. So that's the idea. Another type is expecting higher future price. If you know the price of something is going to rise in the future, you're going to buy more today and you're going to stock it. Okay, so because you anticipate higher price in the future, you're going to buy some more today. Now there is a caveat here. Wow, that's kind of cool. This doesn't apply to everything. So perishable goods are an exception. So think of milk. If you know the price of milk is going to go up in 6 months, are you going to go buy a whole lot of milk today? Doesn't make sense. And there's also storage cost, so you have to take that into account. So there is some limitations with this. And another shifter is population. If the population goes up, let's say because of immigration, then the demand is going to go up. And that should be fairly obvious because there's going to be more buyers in the market. The market demand is the sum of all buyers put together. All right, so pause here and write down your notes. All right, let's move on to supply, which is the other side of the market. Supply is how much ice cream or any other good or service the producers are willing and able to sell at any given price. So here we are focusing on the producers. The supply curve shows the relationship between price and quantity supplied. Okay, so again we have this between. And the law of supply is when the price of a product rises, its quantity supplied increases, all other things being equal. All right, so that's again is our ceteris paribus assumption. This again should be fairly intuitive. Think of producers. Do producers like a higher price or a lower price for their product? Well, they want to make profit, so if the price is higher, they're going to be happy, right? That's why we have this opposite direction here compared to the demand. Here, when the price goes up, the quantity supply goes up. If the price goes down, the quantity supply goes down, which means there is a positive slope or a direct relationship. There is a positive correlation. So here again, we have two ideas. We have willing and able. So when we talk about the willingness of producers, we are talking about their cost, which affects their profit. So in the case of ice cream, what's the cost of making ice cream? Think of all of the ingredients. Think of the milk and the cream, the sugar, the machines that are used, freezers, workers, electricity, anything that you need in order to make ice cream would be part of your cost. When we talk about able, we are talking about technology, the ability to make things. So think of the technology of making ice cream. That could affect the level of supply. Okay? Pause here, take down your notes. Much like demand, we also have supply shifters. Before talking about the supply shifters, there is a word of caution here. Remember your ceteris paribus assumption that all other things are equal? So the idea is you do only one change at a time. Okay? When we talk about supply, you have to assume that the demand is fixed. In other words, when you talk about supply, forget about the buyers. Okay? Don't complicate things by including too many factors at the same time. Just focus on one thing at a time. So right now we're just going to forget about the buyers. We're going to focus on the sellers only. We're only going to focus on the production process. The only change in the world is the given event. Everything else is the same. All right, this is going to simplify our life. So the first thing, which is the most important shifter, is the cost of production. If the cost of production goes up, supply goes down because producers can't cover their expenses, so their output is going to fall. They can't make a profit. Okay? So here's a good example for you to get this idea of inputs and outputs. So think of a bakery. What's the output of a bakery? Bread, right? Bread and pastries. What's the input of a bakery? What do they use to make bread? Flour, eggs, oil. Yeah, let's just say dough. Yeah, so you have input and you have output. Input is what goes into the production process. Output is what comes out. Okay, I'm giving you this very clear example with pictures so that you remember this. Okay, don't mix it. Input is what goes in. Input is the raw material basically. It also includes ovens and workers. Output is the final good and service, which is sold to the consumers, which is sold to the end users. Okay, so output is the same as goods and services. Input, the main input in economics is labor, is workers. But it also includes other things. So we talked about, flour and oil and all that. So all of that is included. So one example is the wage rate. If the wage rate goes up, the supply goes down because firms cannot hire as many workers as before. Okay, so a good thing to remember is that wage is the cost of labor, and labor is one of our main resources. Another example is regulations. If there are more regulations, regulations are restrictions or requirements by the government. If there's more of them, then the supply is going to drop because it makes production more costly. Okay. And another example is taxes on producers. So tax is when the government steals your money. Yeah. So if the producers are taxed for operating, then it's kind of like more cost for them. And the opposite of a tax is a subsidy. If their subsidies is basically government help. When the government helps the producers, let's say the farmers, then they can produce more things. Okay, pause here. Another supply shifter is technological improvement. And that's going to increase the supply because better technology means faster and more efficient production. Okay, so it's about the rate of production, which effectively lowers the unit cost of production. Unit cost means cost per unit, the total cost divided by the quantity produced. So if you have better technology, you can do things faster, and that effectively means saving on costs. So effectively, technology kind of reduces to the first shifter that we talked about. Another obvious shifter is the number of sellers. If there are more sellers around in any industry, the supply of that good or service is going to increase. And the next one is favorable weather. If there is better weather, then it's going to increase the production because it makes it easier. So think of the yield of agricultural products. If there is good sunshine, good rain, it's going to increase the yield. Other examples would be ski resorts, fishing, and construction. So in the case of ski resorts, again, we're not talking about demand. Forget about the demand. We're talking about supply. What's the cost of running a ski resort? So part of that is the snow, right? If you have snow already coming from the nature, then you don't need to create your own artificial snow. So that could save you some costs. For fishing, it's more like the summer. Summer is better. And construction also. Sometimes the construction companies have to shut down because it's just too cold to operate. All right, let's do some fun stuff. We're going to graph supply and demand. So we're going to have a grid, and on the horizontal axis, we're going to have quantity. On the vertical axis, we're going to have price. The line that slopes upward is the supply curve. Remember, there's a direct relationship. The one that slopes downward is the demand curve. There is an inverse relationship. And we have a point in the middle, which is called equilibrium. Yeah, so that's when things balance out, when the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded are equal. All right. And whenever you do a graph, you have to write the name of the market on the top. So in this case, let's say it's the ice cream market. Or it could be any other market. It could be the car market, the cosmetics market, or whatever. But write it down. And when you do problems, you usually have to shift one of the lines. So one of the things is that things are simple. You shift only one thing. Okay, so just focus on one, is either supply or demand. And the simple rule is whenever you have an increase, you shift the line to the right. Whenever you have a decrease, you shift the line to the left. All right, so take your time to draw a neat diagram in your own notes. Use a ruler. You don't have to use grade paper here because you don't have numbers, but make it neat. Make sure you label everything just as you see in the diagram here. This is going to help you later on when things get a bit more advanced, and you always get free marks for labeling. All right, so pause here. That's kind of cool. About the graph that you drew, we're going to do the demand and supply linear, but it could also be curvy. It doesn't make a difference. Usually we don't have numbers, so as long as the slope is fine, then you're doing a good job. Some other concepts that you've seen before. One is this idea of equilibrium. So equilibrium is when the quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. And that's where everybody is happy. Happy means that they get what they want. Okay, the buyers can buy what they want and the sellers can sell what they want. Sometimes the quantity supplied is less than quantity demanded, and that's called a shortage. So which means when there's too much demanded. When the price is too low, that's where you get a shortage. So everyone who wants to sell can sell, but not everyone who wants to buy can buy. So that's when you get a long line. So this picture is from the Soviet Union. where a lot of times they ran into shortages. So you have a lot of buyers who are unhappy because they wanted to get it, but they can't get it. Okay. Anyone who wanted to sell can sell, so the sellers don't have a problem here. It's the buyers who are unhappy in a shortage. And sometimes you have the opposite, which is a surplus, when the quantity supplied is more than the quantity demanded. Too much is supplied when the price is too high. Okay. In this case, everyone who wants to buy can buy. So those who are really interested, they're happy they get it. But the sellers are not happy because they can't sell at all. All right. So some sellers are going to be unhappy because they can't achieve what they wanted. All right. So pause here, write down your notes. Something that you may or may not have seen before is this concept of price controls. Here's where we're talking about government intervention. So there are basically two main types of price control. The first one is called a price ceiling. It's a maximum price of a product imposed by the government, which means that the sellers can't charge more than that. All right, just think of a ceiling. A ceiling is above, right? So that's like the maximum you can go, the highest you can go. And the purpose of that is to protect the buyers. If you think about it, if you're talking about a maximum price is meant to protect the buyers. Okay. And it's applied to products that are deemed necessary for low-income households, right? So because we're kind of worried about, you know, if they're going to be able to purchase those material, then there's going to be a price ceiling in that. An example of this could be gas, for instance, or rent, okay, or some food items. So those could be examples of price ceiling, right? Yeah, so in this case, we are talking about obesity. So you don't want people to buy fatty food. So you could raise the price, right? But that's another form of price control, not a price ceiling. And that would be price floor. So price floor is a minimum price of a product imposed by the government, which means that the buyers can't pay less than that. So the price can be higher than the price floor, but not less. And it's meant to protect the seller. So if you think of the logic here, this is used when we're dealing with poor workers, okay? It's applied to markets where the sellers could be abused, right? And the best example of that is the minimum wage, right? So the minimum wage is meant to protect the sellers of labor. So sellers of labor are workers, okay? The problem with minimum wage is what you see in this cartoon, is that it lowers the willingness of the firms to hire workers, which is going to create unemployment. And we're going to see that in some graphs, but first write these down. Let's talk about a price ceiling. The part that is kind of tricky about a price ceiling is that a price ceiling would be less than the market equilibrium price. And we're going to show how that works with a graph. So imagine any diagram with supply and demand where you have your equilibrium. And that point of equilibrium is going to give you your quantity of equilibrium. So QE is the quantity at equilibrium, and PE is your equilibrium price. All right, so this is kind of like a market for anything. This is just a general market without any government intervention. Then we have this. So this is the market price without any government restriction, right? Now then the government could come in and say, you know what, let's set P1 as a price ceiling. Okay, P1 would be a binding price ceiling. Binding means effective. So you might want to write that down. Binding means effective. It means that it makes a difference. Okay. If we were to set the price ceiling too high, then that's going to be a redundant price ceiling. Okay. I want you guys to pause here and think about what's going on here. This is not tricky. This is not supposed to confuse you. When you think of ceiling, usually a ceiling is up there, right? It's high, right? But if you think of a price ceiling that's too high, then it's going to be redundant. A price ceiling that is to be effective should be low, because if the price ceiling is at P2, what's going to happen? If it's at P2, the price ceiling means that you can't go above it. Well, no one's going to go above P2. Without any government intervention, we are going to be at PE. We're going to be at the equilibrium price, right? So we are already meeting the condition of P2. So P2 is not going to cause any difference. It's not going to create any change. The policy that would create a change is if the price is set as P1. Then what it means is that you're forcing the price to go lower. So you're forcing the ceiling to be lower. Okay? An effective ceiling is a ceiling which is forced to be lower. All right? So for that matter, you can kind of make it the P2 lighter or just get rid of it. All right. Now let's see what happens with what's the result of a price control or a price ceiling. So if the government says that, you know what, let's say this is the market for gas and we are gonna make the price of gas lower than what it would be otherwise. Okay, what's gonna happen is that you have to find your corresponding quantity supplied and quantity demanded, and you find that based on the graphs that you have, right? So at P1 there is that point on the supply curve which is going to give you your quantity supplied. So QS1 corresponds to the quantity supplied at price 1. All right, and you similarly get another quantity which is quantity demanded. Okay, so we're going to get rid of the mess to have more space here. What happens at P1 is that your quantity supplied is less than quantity demanded. What is it called when there is too much quantity supplied and not enough demanded? A shortage. Yeah, so you should be able to show a shortage on a graph, and the way you show a shortage on a graph is just like that. There is a difference between quantity demanded and quantity supplied. All right, so what happens is that at the end of the day the price is lower, it's P1, and the quantity is also lower. The quantity that's produced is QS1 because that's only what the sellers are willing to produce, so it's less than the quantity equilibrium before the government intervention. So the government intervention results in a lower output, which is kind of an important observation in case of a price control. So pause here, draw a nice large graph for yourself with all the labels and take notes. Now let's look at a similar case with a price floor. Now the case with the price floor is exactly the opposite. An effective price floor should be too high, should be above the price of equilibrium. Okay, so we start with the same picture as before. This is before any government intervention. We have equilibrium price PE and equilibrium quantity QE, right? So let's say you have P3, which is above the market equilibrium price. That would be a binding price floor. Again, binding means effective. If your floor is too low, then that would be a redundant price floor because we are already meeting that condition. Our PE is already above P4. So if the government says that, hey, you can't go below P4, well, no one's going below P4. That's going to be redundant. It's not going to cause any change. But if they say that, hey, you can't go below P3, then that's going to cause a change. All right, so P4 is redundant. You can get rid of it. And we are going to see what happens because of a price floor. So price floor would be like minimum wage. So the wage is at PE originally. The government comes in and says, you know what, we're going to raise the minimum wage. Well, at P3, the corresponding quantity demanded is QD3, and the corresponding quantity supplied is QS3. Right, kind of like what we had in the last diagram. And let's get rid of the mess. So at P3, quantity supplied is more than quantity demanded. What is that called? A surplus, right? Now you should be able to show a surplus on a graph, and that's simply the distance between those 2 points, as you see. Okay, so that's how you would show a surplus on a diagram. So the final price based on the government policy is P3, and the final quantity is going to be QD3 because there are so many buyers. The number of buyers is limited to QD3, so that's where we stop, which is less than your original equilibrium quantity. So the moral of the story is that the government's intervention results in a lower output. This is an extremely important observation. If we want to maximize production, the government intervention is not going to help. It's going to only reduce the production. Okay, so it's like, oh no, what have we done, right? That's the result of government intervention in terms of price controls. Pause here, take some notes, and have a great day.